The day the HOA threatened to destroy a 100-year-old mansion, they believed they were enforcing rules. What they did not know was that a single document would change everything. And by the end of this story, the entire town would realize how wrong they were. At the edge of Maple Ridge stood a mansion that seemed frozen in time. Tall oak trees surrounded the old stone walls, and ivy climbed the tall windows like it had been there for generations. The home belonged to a quiet man named Daniel Whitmore. Daniel was not loud or confrontational. He spent most of his mornings repairing parts of the historic house, carefully restoring what time had worn down. To him, the mansion was not just a home. It was a piece of history, but to the newly formed HOA, it was something else entirely. They claimed the mansion violated modern neighborhood guidelines. They complained about the architecture, the landscaping, even the historic wooden gate that had stood there longer than most residents had lived in the town. And then one morning, a bright orange notice appeared on Daniel's gate. The letter claimed the mansion would be demolished if it did not comply with HOA regulations. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalk whispering and staring. Some looked worried. Others looked curious. Daniel stood quietly at the gate reading the notice twice. He didn't argue. He didn't panic. He simply folded the paper carefully and walked back inside the mansion. Because Daniel knew something the HOA didn't, and very soon, the entire town was about to learn the truth. When the HOA delivered the demolition warning, they believed the matter was already settled. But what they didn't realize was that the mansion held a story older than their entire community. The next morning, 3 HOA board members arrived at Daniel's property. Leading them was a woman named Linda Harper, the strict president of the association. Linda stood confidently outside the iron gate with a clipboard in her hand. "This property violates multiple neighborhood codes," she said loudly, making sure the small crowd of neighbors could hear. She pointed at the mansion. "The structure is outdated, the property boundaries are unclear, and the architecture doesn't meet modern community standards." The neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. Many of them secretly loved the mansion. It had always been the most beautiful landmark in Maple Ridge. Daniel stepped outside calmly. He wore a simple sweater and carried a small folder under his arm. "I've lived here my entire life," he said quietly. Linda barely listened. "You've been given 30 days to comply or the structure will be removed," she announced. A murmur spread through the crowd. Daniel looked at the mansion behind him. The same home his grandfather had built. The same walls that had protected 3 generations of his family. Still, he did not argue. Instead, he looked directly at Linda and said something unexpected. "Before you make that decision, you may want to see the original deed." Linda laughed slightly. "The HOA has full authority here." Daniel nodded slowly, and for the first time, a hint of mystery appeared in his calm expression, because the deed held a detail no one had noticed. The tension in Maple Ridge grew quickly after the warning was posted. Residents whispered about the mansion, wondering how a home that had stood for a century could suddenly be threatened, but the HOA seemed determined. A week later, heavy equipment arrived at the edge of the street. Workers began placing small markers along the property line while Linda Harper supervised with clear confidence. "Preparation," she told curious neighbors. Daniel watched from the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't protest. Instead, he quietly made a phone call. Within an hour, a sheriff's vehicle slowly drove up the road. The sheriff stepped out and walked toward the gate. Linda immediately approached him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We're preparing to enforce HOA regulations." The sheriff nodded politely but looked toward Daniel. Daniel walked forward carrying the same small folder he had held earlier. Inside it was a yellow document protected by clear plastic. "This is the original property deed," Daniel explained calmly. The sheriff took the document and studied it carefully. At first his expression remained neutral, but then his eyebrows slowly lifted. He looked again at the land around the mansion, then he turned back toward the HOA board. "Where exactly did you say the HOA boundaries begin?" he asked. Linda answered confidently, but the sheriff's next words changed the entire situation. Silence spread across Maple Ridge as the sheriff studied the document again. The neighbors leaned forward, sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold. The sheriff looked at Linda carefully. "This deed was registered in 1923, he said slowly. Daniel nodded. "It was granted directly by the county," he explained. Linda crossed her arms. "That doesn't change HOA authority." But the sheriff shook his head slightly. "It actually changes everything." He unfolded the document fully and pointed to the survey map printed across the page. The map showed the mansion at the center of a large piece of land, much larger than anyone had imagined. Linda leaned closer. Her confident expression began to fade. "According to this," the sheriff continued, The Whitmore estate was declared a historic protected property. The neighbors gasped quietly. The sheriff looked up again, and more importantly, he added, "This property predates the entire HOA." Linda blinked in disbelief, "But that can't be right." The sheriff folded the document carefully and handed it back to Daniel. "The HOA cannot regulate a property that existed before the association was created." The crowd began whispering loudly now. The workers paused their equipment, and for the first time, Linda looked uncertain, but the sheriff hadn't finished explaining, because there was still one more detail in the deed that would shock everyone standing there. The sheriff glanced again at the valley around the mansion. The oak trees, the wide lawns, even the small path leading toward the nearby creek. Then he looked back at the HOA board. "You might want to see the rest of the survey map," he said calmly. Linda stepped closer, still trying to maintain control of the situation. Daniel opened the document and gently spread the map across the hood of the sheriff's vehicle. The old ink lines stretched far beyond the mansion grounds. Linda leaned forward. Her eyes widened. The map didn't just show the mansion property, it showed nearly the entire hillside surrounding Maple Ridge. The sheriff tapped the corner of the document. "This land was granted to the Whitmore family over 100 years ago." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Linda pointed toward the nearby homes, "But those properties belonged to the neighborhood." The sheriff shook his head. "They were later subdivided from the Whitmore estate." Daniel stood quietly beside him. "My grandfather sold the land that eventually became this neighborhood," he explained. A stunned silence filled the street. That meant the HOA had been built on land originally owned by Daniel's family, and now the board members slowly realized something even more surprising. They weren't threatening a rule breaker, they had been threatening the original landowner. The atmosphere on the street had completely changed. Only minutes earlier the HOA board had stood confidently beside demolition markers. Now they stood quietly, absorbing the truth. Linda tried to regain her composure. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said carefully, but the sheriff simply pointed toward the historic registry number printed on the deed. "This property is legally protected," he explained, "and the original owner still lives here." Daniel looked across the valley. For years he had watched the town grow around the old mansion. New homes, new roads, new families, but the mansion had remained the same. Linda glanced at the workers who had brought the equipment. They slowly began packing up their tools. Neighbors who had once whispered now smiled quietly. One elderly resident stepped forward. "My grandfather used to talk about the Whitmore estate," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "The house was built by my great-grandfather." Linda finally looked at Daniel directly. For the first time, her voice sounded uncertain. "So the HOA has no authority here?" The sheriff answered calmly, "Not over this property." The entire situation had turned around in a matter of minutes, but Daniel still had one final thing to say before the crowd left. The sun slowly lowered over Maple Ridge as the crowd began to disperse. What had started as a confrontation had become a quiet moment of reflection for the entire neighborhood. Daniel stood beside the gate of the old mansion, the same gate where the demolition notice had been placed just days earlier. Linda approached slowly. Her confident tone was gone. "I didn't know the history," she admitted. Daniel nodded kindly. "Most people don't." He looked back at the mansion. "My family built this house long before the neighborhood existed." The sheriff climbed back into his vehicle while the last construction truck drove away. The tension that once filled the street had disappeared. Instead, the mansion stood peacefully again, just as it had for 100 years. Some neighbors even stopped to admire the house as they walked by. Daniel folded the old deed carefully and returned it to the folder. Because sometimes the truth isn't loud or dramatic, sometimes it simply waits for the right moment to be revealed, and that moment had finally arrived. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.